So it is my pleasure to introduce Clint Smith. He is a staff writer at The Atlantic and the author of the poetry collection, Counting Descent. The book won the 2017 Literary Award for Best Poetry Book from the Black Caucus of the American Library Association and was a finalist for the NAACP Award. But we are here today to talk about your #1 New York Times bestseller, I like saying that, How the Word is Passed. And here, this is a reckoning with the history of slavery in America. And one of the things I want to say first and foremost is that in the book, you literally reckon with the history of slavery, but not just from a distance. You literally go there. You go to 8 different places in the United States, then you make your way out to Senegal. And to be honest, there were moments when I was concerned for your physical and emotional well-being. And I think there were others who were also concerned, and we'll talk about that. But one of the questions that I think we need to get out of the way first and foremost is, why did you feel the need to write this book at this time?
Yeah, well, thank you all so much for coming. This is a very surreal experience for me. I lived for many years on the corner of 9th and O, and this area looked very different, but I came to this event as an audience member for so many years, just kind of stumbling out of my apartment and being like, what's going on down the street? And so to be here on the other side is a real treat, and I appreciate you all coming to spend your Saturday thinking about books and literature, and it's really, really wonderful, and I appreciate you so much. This book began, in some ways it began in 2017 when I was watching several Confederate statues come down in my hometown in New Orleans, statues of P.G.T. Beauregard, Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee. And as I was watching these statues come down, I was thinking about what it meant that I grew up in a majority black city in which there were more homages to enslavers than there were to enslaved people. And what are the implications of that? What does it mean that to get to school, I had to go down Robert E. Lee Boulevard? To get to the grocery store, I had to go down Jefferson Davis Parkway? That my middle school was named after a leader of the Confederacy? That my parents still live on a street today named after someone who owned over 150 enslaved people? Because the thing is, symbols and names and iconography aren't just symbols. They're reflective of the stories that people tell. And those stories shape the narratives that communities carry, and those narratives shape public policy, and public policy shapes the material conditions of people's lives, which isn't to say that if you just take a 60-foot tall statue of Robert E. Lee down, you suddenly erase the racial wealth gap, but it does help us recognize the sort of ecosystem of ideas and stories and narratives that help shape American history and better provide us with the context to understand the way that certain communities have been intentionally and disproportionately harmed throughout American history. And so I was looking around New Orleans, and I was trying to get a sense of, well, what are the places that tell the story well? What are the places and people who maybe should tell the story better than they do? And part of it is that I realized that at a moment where I realized that New Orleans was at one point the largest and busiest slave market in the United States, and I had realized I didn't know anything about the history of slavery in New Orleans in any way that was commensurate with the impact or legacy that it had on my city, on my state, on my country. And so I started looking around New Orleans and thinking about something, a book that a professor of mine wrote, Walter Johnson wrote this incredible book called Soul by Soul about the history of the slave trade in New Orleans. And he has this line at the beginning of the book where he says the whole city is a memorial to slavery. It's in the roads enslaved people paved, it's in the buildings enslaved people constructed, it's in the soil enslaved people are buried in, it's in the levees enslaved people built. And I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about, well, okay, I wonder what this looks like in New Orleans, but I also wonder what this looks like across the country. And so I traveled across the country, went to monuments, memorials, plantations, prisons, cemeteries, neighborhoods, cities, to try to get a sense of what are the places that are telling the story honestly, what are the places that are running from the story, and what are the places that are kind of doing something in between. And all of this was really oriented around the fact that Toni Morrison has this old adage that so many of us are familiar with, where it's like, if there's a book that wants to be written, that if there's a book you want to read that hasn't been written yet, then you need to be the one to write it. And I wanted to write the sort of book that I felt like I needed when I was like a 15 or 16-year-old kid who was looking around New Orleans and being inundated with these messages about all the things that were wrong with black people in New Orleans and the reason that we were in a community saturated with violence and poverty. And I remember the feeling of not having the language. I remember the feeling of not having intellectual or historical framework with which to push back against so much of the pathology that we were being inundated with. And it wasn't until so much later in my life that I started getting that information, right? When I went to grad school and started reading some of these seminal sociological and historical texts that provided me with language that was really emancipating and really freeing and gave me an understanding of, the reason one part of New Orleans looks one way and another part of New Orleans looks another way is not simply because of the people in those communities, but because of what has been done to those communities over the course of generations and generations and generations. And so I wanted to write the sort of book that I thought would have been helpful for me. I had been a high school teacher. I wanted to write the sort of book that would have been helpful for my students. And that was the sort of North Star of the project in many ways.
And one of the things that you also do in this book is you turn to the dead. You go to the Blandford Cemetery where the Confederate soldiers are buried. And I want you to talk to us a little bit about that decision. So why did you feel the need to go there, and what was that like for you?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, one of the reasons I like writing this book so much is that it surprised me often. So I didn't write in my book proposal, like, I'm gonna go spend the day with the members of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. My wife wouldn't have liked that. I was actually, you set out and you have an idea of all the different places you're gonna go for your project. And I actually went that day I went to Petersburg, Virginia, because I thought I was gonna do a chapter on Civil War battlefields. And this was the site of the siege of Petersburg at the end of the Civil War, the thing that really sort of hammered down the end and the fall of the Confederacy in so many ways. And I went to this battlefield and it was fascinating, it was interesting, but it didn't have the sort of thing that I was looking for. But I was in conversation with one of the National Park Rangers there, and I was telling him about my project, and he was like, oh, you should go to that Confederate cemetery down the street. And I was like, no, sir, I'm not gonna go to that Confederate cemetery down the street. And so that's the interesting thing about being a writer is that there's regular Clint and then there's writer Clint. So regular Clint is like, nope, I'm getting back in my car, I'm going back home. And then the writer Clint, it's like the two little things on your shoulder, and it's like regular Clint and writer Clint. Writer Clint's like, go to the Confederacy. And regular Clint is like, that's terrible advice, don't ever do that. But as a writer, it was clear that this is where the story was taking me. And so I went to the cemetery. And as I write about in the book, it was this sort of bizarre experience where I was walking around and getting a tour through this chapel in the middle of one of the largest Confederate cemeteries in the country. And the word Confederacy wasn't said once, the word slavery wasn't said once. They were talking about the beauty of the windows and how the windows were made and the construction of the church and the specific bricks they used. And it was such a conspicuous absence. And I remember going into the visitor center after and talking to the director of the center, and on the desk in the visitor center were these sets of flyers, like a pile of flyers that said Sons of Confederate Veterans holding their Memorial Day, their annual Memorial Day celebration. And I was like, what is that over there? And she put her hand on it immediately and flipped it over, and she was like, I don't know what that is. I've never seen that before. And I was like, ma'am, you're the director of this site. You've never seen it before. She was like, I don't even know what they're talking about. And I was like, okay, well, this is where the story is taking me to. So then a couple weeks later, I came back, and I had to ask permission from my wife to go to spend the day with the members of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. And she was like, as long as you bring Billy. And Billy is a friend, and he is white. And so I was like, Billy, you gotta come. and he's very generous. I'm the best man in his wedding in 2 weeks. But he's also been on his own journey of sort of thinking about his own relationship, his own family's relationship to this history, because he has family members who are in the Confederacy. So, but to get to the event, I remember going there, and it was such an unsettling event, but it was also so clarifying, because you realize that for so many people, history is not about primary source documents or empirical evidence. It's a story that they're told. And it's a story that they tell. It's an heirloom that's passed down across generations. It's something where loyalty takes precedence over truth. I always remember a conversation I had with a guy named Jeff. Jeff had this long salt and pepper ponytail, handlebar mustache, round belly, this biker vest with Confederate paraphernalia all over it. And he was telling me the story about how like when he was a kid, his grandfather used to bring him to this cemetery, and they would sit in this beautiful gazebo at the center of the cemetery, and his grandfather would play his banjo and sing the old Dixie anthem, and they would watch the sun set behind the trees and watch as the fireflies came out of the woods at night and watch the deer graze around the tombstones. And his grandfather would tell him the story of those men who were buried in this land. He would say, these men didn't fight a war over slavery. These men weren't racist. These men were fighting a war to protect their family, protect their country, to protect their land, their home, their way of life. And now Jeff told me that he now brings his granddaughters to that same cemetery and sings the same songs with them that his grandfather sang with him, and tells the same stories to his grandchildren that his grandfather told to him. And so the thing is, if I went to Jeff and I was like, well, Jeff, I know that your grandfather told you that the people buried here and what they fought for had nothing to do with slavery, or that secession had nothing to do with slavery. But if you look at all the primary source evidence that we have, it's very clear what this is about. If you look at the Declarations of Confederate Secession, for example, in 1861, a state like Mississippi says, our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest in the world. Right, so they're not vague about why they're seceding from the Union. They're quite clear about it. But to ask Jeff to accept that would mean that he would have to accept that his grandfather was lying to him. Yeah. And if he has to accept that his grandfather was lying to him, he has to think about all the other stories that he has been told by this man or by people he loves that may not be true. And that threatens to sort of crumble the foundation upon which his relationship with these people is built. So not only are you asking somebody like Jeff to do a sort of reassessment of American history that might be inconvenient, it represents like an existential crisis, a sense of their identity being stripped away from them. And I think that that's an important part of this conversation, as we have this talk about like critical race theory and the history wars and people struggling to accept the sort of more holistic story of America that we are beginning to tell. Part of it is because there's a lot of fear, right? And there's a lot of interior fear where people's sense of self is so deeply tied to a story that they have been told by people they love. And when they are told that that story is incorrect, so much of their sense of self begins to crumble.
Yeah, I'm reminded of a dear aunt that she recently passed, but she would go to funerals, and one of the things that she did that she should not have done is she would loudly comment on both the obituary, items that she thought weren't true, because she knew about the moral failings of all these people.
Oh, man.
And she would also comment on the quality of the casket.
Okay.
And so part of what I hear from you is it feels as if you're that auntie,
okay.
Who is saying, I know you lost your grandfather and your great-great-grandfather, and you loved all these people.
Yeah.
But there are things in this obituary, and there are things that are happening right now in the eulogy that simply aren't true.
Yeah.
And so how do you go and tell someone who is in mourning, and I think there's a collective mourning, historical collective mourning,
absolutely,
about things that are lost and people lost, and how do you tell them, sorry, that eulogy that you just heard that gave you so much comfort, it should have included information about how sometimes some of these folks were monstrous,
yeah,
or they were at least supporting a monstrous institution. How do you do that?
Yeah. That what your aunt did sounds strangely inappropriate, but she also sounds like a lot of fun. So sorry. But, for me, in the context of this book, I was not interested in challenging the folks in that moment in time. I didn't want to approach this moment, or I didn't want to go to members of the Sons of Confederate Veterans, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, and do a sort of like Daily Show thing where I try to make them look ridiculous or sort of create caricatures of them. I think there's a role for that sort of thing. It's not to speak ill of that, but part of what I was interested in was understanding what they believed was the truth. And that could only happen if I approached them with a certain level of generosity that was difficult to maintain sometimes, right? But if I knew that if I were at all antagonistic, I knew that if I tried to challenge them in the moment, I knew that if I tried to ask them what they believe, and then when they told me, say that what they believe was wrong, they would either shut down or and I was thinking about my safety, I was thinking about all sorts of things. What I was more interested in was trying to understand the essence of what they believed. Because I also think that it's so easy to turn folks like that into caricatures. It's so easy to turn them into sort of two-dimensional renderings of themselves. And the thing that we have to grapple with collectively is that these are not caricatures of people. These are people who go to the grocery store we go to, they go to the same post office we go to, they take their kids to the same soccer games, right? And so these are not people who exist in like a far off, distant land. So many of them are part of our worlds and communities in ways that we may or may not be cognizant of. And I think it felt really important to convey that three-dimensionality, right? That for Jeff, this is not just about like what the sort of undergirding beliefs might support racism and white supremacy, and that certainly is a part of it. But it also is about the way that he feels about his grandfather. It's also about the sort of tradition that he wants to pass on to his grandchildren. And I think we have to hold the totality of that, not as an excuse for it, but as a recognition that the way that people come to these beliefs is far more complicated than we are often led to believe. And so part of what I'm trying to do in the book is that I have these conversations with these folks, and then I let the primary source documents, I let the history itself sort of be the rebuttal. And so in that moment I had to, I was just thinking about, well, who is my audience? My audience is not, I'm not trying to convince these people to believe in something that is so deeply entrenched within them. I'm interested in, both for myself and for the reader, sort of laying out the dissonance that exists between what these people believe and then what the empirical evidence before us shows and demonstrates, and how, like, time and time again, the talking point from a member of the Confederate veterans is revealed to be false by the evidence that we have from the range of historical documents we have at hand.
And I'm going to stay on this theme, right? Because there's Richard Poplar, who becomes known as the Black Confederate soldier. And as you're thinking about, and you do this very well in the book, how we have these public characters, they populate our histories, and they do work. They tell us who we are. They somehow justify things we've done, and they also tell us things that we ought to do, right? And so, talk to us a little bit about Richard Poplar.
Yeah, so Richard Poplar, at the Blandford Cemetery, there was a gravestone for Richard Poplar, and the mythology around him is that they believed that he was a Confederate soldier, right? And so he is sort of lifted up as this great example. He's sort of wielded as a tool to demonstrate to people who they believe are of bad faith that the war was very clearly not about racism. The war was clearly not about racism because, look, here is this black person, this black soldier who fought for the Confederacy. And in reality, Richard Poplar was not a soldier. Richard Poplar was a cook, and a sort of servant. And he was among many enslaved people who were forced to be servants and cooks and work on behalf of the Confederate Army because they were enslaved, right? And so it's so bizarre, but it's also it makes the whole thing even more insidious that you would use a person who was forced to work on behalf of a cause that was fighting to keep them enslaved, and then suggest that this person is an example of how this war could not have been over such a thing, even though it very clearly, the very reason that they were participating in it was because they had no other choice. And so there's a great book by Kevin Levin about the myth of the Black Confederates. I encourage everybody to read it and spend some time with it. But it's something that exists in Confederate sort of neo-Confederate circles. You'll often see it like on social media, on Facebook. There'll be like, oh, this day, whether it's Richard Poplar or someone else in a different state, they will sort of lift it up as, especially over the last few years in the midst of the Black Lives Matter movement, as a sort of like, hey, look, like this isn't about what you all say it's about. This is actually like, how could this black person fight for the Confederacy if this was really about slavery? And like I said, it leaves a really nasty taste in your mouth because it makes the whole thing even more egregious.
And speaking of egregious, let's talk about the children. So you do it so beautifully in the book that I'm going to ask that you turn to page 61 at the bottom, and continue on into the paragraph at the top of 62. So it's reading time.
This is this is from the chapter on the Whitney Plantation. Inside the church were 2 rows of wooden pews separated by hexagonal white columns. Scattered throughout the church's interior, standing next to the pews, sitting on the floor, hiding in the corners, were several hand-carved statuettes. There were more than 24 life-size clay sculptures of small children, each one so alive despite its inanimateness, intrinsically detailed from the contours of their lips to the bridges of their nose. My heart jumped out when I turned the corner and saw them, because just for a moment, I thought they were real children. Their clothing was simple and sparse. The boys were wearing pairs of oversized overalls, though some wore only shorts, leaving their chests exposed. Some were wearing bucket hats that sat just above their eyes. Girls were wearing simple dresses, some of them with their hair wrapped underneath cloths tied around their heads, and others with small locks falling down their forehead. Their eyes were hollow and tender. Rays of light shot through the Gothic windows of the church and fell directly onto the figurines, as if they were wearing the sunlight as a shawl.
So you're a father, and you walk in and you see this reminder of the totality of what slavery was for families. What did you do and feel in that moment?
Yeah, I started this book. I have a 5-year-old boy and a 3-year-old girl. And when I was writing this, when I began the book, I started in 2017, the same year my son was born. And it's interesting because I think the way that I previously understood slavery, and the thing that would come to mind when I thought about it for so many years was sort of singularly in the context of its physical brutality, the sort of spectacle of physical cruelty. And I think that's in part because that is the image or the idea that we have been kind of inundated with. When we are meant to understand the violence of the institution, we think about the famous scene in Roots where Toby is being beaten or Kunta Kinte rather is being beaten until he says that his name is Toby. And there are all sorts of different examples like that. And for some reason, for so long, I didn't think of it in terms of family separation or the impact that families would have it. But that changed a lot when I had my own children. And as our family was growing while I was working on this project, I'll always remember being at the Whitney in this moment of standing inside one of the original slave cabins on the plantation. And these spaces, for me, part of the power of this project and part of the reason I was drawn to it was because I believe so deeply in the power of putting your body in the physical spaces where history happened. And so I was standing in the slave cabin, and I sort of closed my eyes, and I just imagined what it would be like. If I went to bed with my kids, my wife, and then I woke up, and my children were gone. And I had no idea where they went. I had no idea who had taken them. I had no idea if I would ever see them again. And then you have this moment where you realize that this was the omnipresent threat that hung over millions and millions of enslaved people every single moment of their lives, right? The idea that at any moment, you could be separated and stripped away from the people you love most, from your spouse, from your children, from your parents, from your neighbors, from your community, from your brother, from your sister. And I hadn't thought about the sort of psychological terror that imposes. And I write about this in the chapter, for so many years, I was I remember being a kid in class, and whenever they taught us about slavery, me, along with so many kids in my class, would be like, I would never let that happen to me. I would run away, that happens in part because so many of the stories we're told about slavery are from the perspective of people who did run away, right? The stories, the 2 most famous enslaved people in American history are Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, in part because we're so inspired by their journey, but also what can happen is that can inadvertently give us a distorted sense of what life was like for the vast majority of enslaved people. The vast majority of enslaved people did not escape. The vast majority of enslaved people did not learn to read and write. The vast majority of enslaved people did not become ardent and famous abolitionists. The vast majority of enslaved people were in places where they were subjected to a consistent terror, of psychological and physical terror that is difficult for any of us to fathom. And we're just people, we're just ordinary human beings, as we all are, just trying to make a meaningful life amid unfathomable circumstances. And part of what prevented so many people from even entertaining the idea of running away, even if they had the physical ability to do it themselves, was the fact that even if they got away, they knew that the consequences, if they couldn't be enacted on them and their body themselves, that they would be enacted on the people they left behind. And so it's not just a question of like, why didn't this person run away? Or like, if I could have run away, I would have, because the insidiousness of the institution is that there's a sort of collective punishment that can be enacted on any person at any given time. So I try to imagine what it would be like to be separated from my children in such a fashion, or to even fear that that could happen, like every day that I woke up. I couldn't even finish the thought exercise fully because it was so viscerally upsetting. But that was such a huge and enormous part of what slavery was. It was such a huge and enormous part of what it did. I mean, 25% of enslaved people in interstate sales were separated from their families, right? And the numbers, and that's just the number we know. Some historians estimate that it was upwards of 50% of people who were enslaved were separated from their families. And it's just, and you see this, you see the ads that they put in papers after the end of the Civil War, where like across the South, people are putting these ads, black people who were formerly enslaved are putting these ads in the paper where they're saying like, I haven't seen my husband in 25 years, but he was sold to this plantation in Mississippi. He has a scar under his right eye. He has a birthmark on his left cheek. And if you know him, we called him Will. And like, it's just people who are looking for their loved ones after not seeing them for decades. And it really demonstrates how central that was to the institution being able to operate in the way that it did.
And now my last question so that we can open it up to the room. You learn things from school children in Senegal about why it's important to pass the word and to pass it along, right? So could you share some of their lessons and reasonings for the importance of telling the full history of slavery?
Yeah, one of the ways that I sort of move through the book is I'm traveling across the country, and the original impetus of the book was to travel across America, all these different places that had relationships to the history of slavery. And as I kind of did that, I realized that I was becoming increasingly interested in trying to get a sense of how the story of slavery was told, not only here in the United States, but also where it originated, right? Like, how is the story of slavery told from the place where captured Africans were brought across the ocean into the New World? And so I spent some time in college studying abroad in Senegal, and so I was familiar with the country and had spent some time there and had a really powerful experience that changed my life when I was there for several months. And I went back to Senegal, I went back to Dakar, this time with the specific intention to go to some of these sites, for example, like Gorée Island, that have a specific relationship to the history of slavery, to try to get a sense of, well, how are school children in Senegal taught about the history of the slave trade? How are they taught about their ancestors? Or it wouldn't be their ancestors, because if they had been their ancestors, they would be in the United States. But how are they taught about the members of their ancestral community who were taken away and shipped to these places that no one could have imagined? And I encountered in my journey this brilliant group of young women who were at an all-girls boarding school on Gorée Island, where tens of thousands of enslaved people had been sent in the midst of the slave trade, and they just had such a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between colonialism and slavery, and we're speaking to the ways that some of the same ideas that undergirded and justified a history of colonialism sort of further taken to their logical conclusion justified the slave trade. And they were sort of using all of this, their intellect to push back against so much of that insidious philosophy and so many of these ideas. And part of it was I was so moved by the fact that they had such a clear sense of their own identity and a clear sense of the work how difficult it is for a country that had been colonized until the 1960s to sort of begin to strip itself away from the story that Europeans had told them about themselves, to begin to tell a story that is grounded in their own history, separate from the history that was imposed on them. And it just, these are like 16-year-old young girls, and it just, when I was 16, all I thought about was like soccer and quesadillas. And so, these girls out here, challenging the ideas of Voltaire were really powerful, and I think were represented. It was an important part of the book to include for me, because I really wanted to make sure we were telling the story in its totality, which is not to say that like what these girls believe is representative of all West African children, but I think it was an important insight into a part of the story that we don't always consider, right? Like we think about like, well, how are Black children in the United States, or children in the United States writ large, how are they taught about the history of slavery and how it shaped the United States? And I don't know that we often consider how children in West Africa are taught about a phenomenon that stripped away tens of millions of people from that country, and the sort of social, economic, and cultural implications that has.
Thank you. So now we have microphones here at the front of the room. Come up with your questions or comments. And I see someone here.
Hello. Thank you. Great talk, great conversation, wonderful book. First of all, I just want to point out that I think the National Book Festival took a little page from your book, rather your cover, with regards to the design of this.
I noticed that too.
Yeah.
I was like, I was just going to let it slide for now.
So my question is, so you mentioned that you wanted to write this book, type of book that you wanted to read as a teenager, and I totally, that's such a, I also wish I had read this when I was a younger person. And I'm wondering, I know that like right after you finish this book, pandemic, shut down everything, but I wonder if you've had the opportunity to be able to speak to sort of young people who've read your book and sort of what they've thought about the book. And then I've always wondered this about authors who interview random people, if any of them have come to you after the book, like has Jeff or Jim approached you and just sort of had stuff to say?
Yeah, Jeff has not. I'm sure I'm on like some Confederate message board somewhere and they're like talking trash. But so to answer the first part, I've done a lot of virtual, my book came out in June 2021. And so I did probably a virtual event like every, 5 days a week for like a year. And it was as difficult as it was not to be in rooms like this, right? To be in rooms with readers. I think in some ways I got to reach more people or be in conversation with more people because I was just in my office. I like came upstairs, I like finished my ham and cheese sandwich, and then I like talked to a class, or I talked to a university, or I talked to, and there was a really cool moment, a kind of full circle moment where I've had a couple of them where my students at my old high school were assigned the book, and I sort of zoomed in and talked to them. And so I could literally see these like 16-year-old versions of myself in the same desk that I once sat in, reading, having my book assigned as in their American history class. And that was an incredible moment. And I just got back I'm an alum of Davidson College, and my book was selected as the common read for the freshmen this year. And so I just got back from Davidson last week, talking to an auditorium full of freshmen and sitting in the same seats that I once sat in. And so I've had many moments like that have felt very full circle for me. Like I was thinking about the freshman Clint who was sitting at Davidson. I was thinking about 15-year-old Clint, who was sitting at Ben Franklin High School in New Orleans, and that's been really special. And in terms of people who were in the book, I mean, it's interesting because like when you tell people in 2017, 18, 19, when I was telling people, oh, I'm working on this book, and they, I think most people are like, oh, that's so cute. They're like, that's very sweet. You're working on a book. And then it came out, and I think they were like, oh, that I didn't know. I think it's different for them to see their names in it and to like hear people discuss them like on, when I'm on MSNBC and somebody's like, so David, in your Monticello chat, so like I've been in touch with David from Monticello. I'm always in touch with the folks at Whitney Plantation and try to support a lot of their work. Damaris in New York. I've not heard from the people whose works, whose like renderings of their history I was challenging. I've not heard from the members of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. I have heard from Angola, who are telling me that they are sort of in the process of reimagining how they tell the story of themselves. It remains to be seen because like, if you go on Angola's, the Angola Museum website, they still have, we didn't get a chance to talk about Angola, but like Angola is a bizarre place in so many ways, in part because it is the largest maximum security prison in the country, built on top of a former plantation where the vast majority of people are black men serving life sentences. But it also has a gift shop at the entrance of it. And in the gift shop, you can buy coffee mugs and shot glasses and stuffed bears dressed in prison garb. And on one of the coffee mugs, there is the silhouette of a watchtower. And above and below the watchtower, it says Angola, a gated community. As if to like make a mockery of the thousands of people who are incarcerated there. And so they have told me that like, I know they've read the book and they're telling me all the things that they're doing to change, but I think if you still, as of last time I checked, if you Google Angola Prison Museum, or like the gift shop offerings will come up, and I think they still have so many of those things. So, it's a journey for everyone. But I hope that this book, I'm heartened that it is something that is pushing people to think, reconsider the way that they do their work at all.
Yes. And now we're going to take 3 questions at once.
I'm so long-winded. I need to be better. Let's try to get as many as we can. Yeah. I'm gonna try to like speed flash rounds.
Yeah, because they're telling me we have 5 minutes.
All right, let's go.
Okay, this is what we're gonna do. We're gonna do 4 quick questions, right, left, and then you're gonna pick from those. And you can just answer however you can, and then we'll see how we do. Okay.
All right, okay.
I've done this before, it works.
Okay.
Sort of, okay.
So I teach 4th and 5th grade advanced academics in Virginia, and Virginia happens to be the year where they learn extensively about Virginia history. And so, in teaching Virginia history, I use our textbook and Ibram X. Kendi's Stamped for Kids alongside. So my question is, what I really loved about how the word is passed is, like you said, you physically standing in the spaces where history happened, and I think that uniquely lends itself to that introduction in upper elementary school to American history. So my question is there a young adult version in the works? Could there be? What are your thoughts on that?
Okay. Left.
Thank you. I feel like this question is so different from that. So about the writing process, I know that there are so many parts of this book that are moving and beautifully told, and before this you wrote a book of poetry. What was that shift like to go from poetry to a work of nonfiction in terms of style, tone, and finding like the voice of this book in comparison to your poetic voice?
Right.
That was exactly my question.
Oh, that's great.
Oh, perfect. Left. Yes.
You have partially answered my question already, responding to others, but I was profoundly shocked reading your book how much, as what I consider educated person, I did not know, particularly the Angola chapter and the basic replacement of slavery with prison labor. And I would like to know how we as a society can get beyond just not knowing basic things of our history.
Right, and then the last word. Yes.
Thank you for your work. It's so powerful. As a policy researcher, we don't write like that. And I know you mentioned narrative and ideas being in an ecosystem with public policy. How can we strengthen, our work and learn from the way that you write to be more effective in policymaking?
And our last question.
Hi, I'm an English teacher in Northern Virginia, and I actually teach counting descent. And in Virginia, recently there's been a very Governor Glenn Youngkin has set up a tip line where parents and students can report teachers for teaching divisive content. And of course, it's up to the students and the parents to decide what that is. So I was wondering if you had any advice for educators who, like me, want to teach your work.
All right.
The last word in a minute or so.
Is there a YA version? We'll see. We'll see. We are in conversations about it now. I wasn't thinking about doing a YA version or a middle grade version, but I've had so many teachers come up to me and ask me about it. We'll see. We'll see. I think a year ago I would have been like, no, definitely not. And I think I'm like being softened by all of the requests. But we'll see. We'll see. What I do is I have this course I do online on YouTube called Crash Course Black American History. Some of you might be familiar with. And it is these sort of 12 to 15-minute videos that are like partially animated that are talking about different parts of Black American history. And that is what I feel like is my very direct contribution to classrooms and teachers and trying to find new ways to bring those histories in different forms to young people. In terms of the style of the book, I mean, poetry is my North Star. It's in everything I do. I came up as a writer, as a poet. I don't know how to write without thinking of it as poetry in so many ways. And for me, this book, I wanted to write a sort of book that allowed me to write in ways that felt like it was doing justice to my different sort of literary sensibilities, both as a poet, as a journalist, as a scholar, as somebody who loves fiction and novels. I wanted to create a history book that felt novelistic. And so, poetry is what taught me how to write, and I don't know how to write without that being a part of that conversation. Policy, I mean, I think that, I don't think that policy writers should necessarily write like me. I think that I rely on so many white papers that I read from different policy places. I think the most important thing is just always grounding it in the human story and making sure that we are like grounding it in humanity and empathy, regardless of the form it takes on. And then there was one advice, this is the last one because they're saying wrap it up. It's hard to operate well with bad faith actors, but I think one of the most important things to do is make sure that your students and their parents understand the difference between trying to like indoctrinate them and just trying to teach them like a full, honest version of this history. And that's hard because people's sense of what that is and what that looks like has been so distorted and weaponized. But I think when we talk about our founding fathers, when we talk about this country, it's not that we're trying to indoctrinate people with a particular set of ideological messages or ideas. It's just that we're trying to tell a story that reflects the totality of this country in all of its complexity.
So for the revival and the passing of the word, we thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for coming.